When Mark bought his little slice of paradise on the edge of Maple Ridge Estates, he thought he had found peace. The house was modest, tucked away at the corner of a cul-de-sac, with a big backyard that opened into a field of golden grass. For years, it had been his dream, a quiet place where he could finally breathe, build, and live life on his own terms. But he hadn't fully understood what came with that perfect neighborhood, the homeowners association. At first, it seemed harmless. The HOA newsletter arrived every month, filled with cheerful updates about bake sales and community pool maintenance. But behind those smiles and neatly printed bulletins lurked something far less pleasant: the endless rules. Grass height limits. Paint color approvals. Trash bin placement. And of course, unauthorized structures, the rule that would soon flip Mark's calm life upside down. It began when Mark decided to build a small shed at the back of his property. He worked weekends, sweating under the summer sun, cutting and assembling reclaimed wood. It wasn't fancy, just a sturdy little space to store his tools, lawnmower, and the woodworking projects he'd picked up as a hobby. He even painted it to match his house, making sure it didn't stick out. But just as the final coat dried, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It wasn't a friendly one. Notice of violation, unauthorized structure, shed construction. The HOA claimed he hadn't filed a request for approval. The letter carried a $500 fine and a demand to remove or modify the structure immediately. Mark stared at it in disbelief. He thought it must be a mistake. He had checked the bylaws when he moved in, sheds under a certain height and within the property line didn't need approval. Still, the HOA saw it differently. At first, he tried reasoning. He attended their next board meeting, explaining that his shed followed all the stated guidelines. The board, led by a woman named Carol, the kind of person who always introduced herself as president of the HOA, before her actual name, dismissed him without much thought. They insisted he'd broken the rules. "We can't make exceptions," Carol said, her voice sharp and self-righteous. "If we let one person build without approval, everyone will." Mark left the meeting frustrated but not defeated. He decided to appeal the fine, sending photos, measurements, and proof of compliance. Weeks went by, but instead of an answer, another letter arrived. This one was worse. They doubled the fine, accusing him of non-compliance. It felt personal now, as if the board was trying to make an example out of him. Neighbors began whispering. Some sympathized, others avoided him, not wanting to get on the HOA's bad side. But Mark wasn't the type to back down from unfairness. He'd built everything he had from scratch, including the tools in that shed. The more they pushed, the more determined he became to push back. He started researching the HOA charter, reading every line, every outdated clause, every legal loophole. The more he read, the more he realized how badly the board had been overstepping their authority. Many of their so-called rules weren't even legally enforceable. They'd been intimidating homeowners into compliance, counting on no one questioning them. Mark filed a formal complaint to the county's zoning office, attaching photos of his shed and citing the correct municipal codes. Weeks later, an inspector came out to verify. His verdict? The shed was completely within regulations. No violations whatsoever. Mark smiled as he watched the inspector's signature dry on the report, proof that the HOA had no case. When he sent that official document to the HOA, he expected an apology or at least an acknowledgement. Instead, they went silent. Then, a few weeks later, another letter came, not about the shed this time, but about his unapproved materials. They claimed the wood didn't match community standards. Mark laughed out loud when he read that one. It was clear now, this wasn't about the shed. It was about control. So he made a decision. If they wanted a battle over property aesthetics, he'd give them one they'd never forget. He wouldn't just fight their fine, he'd turn the tables completely. The seed of an idea took root in his mind, something bigger, something that would use their own obsession with community property against them. Over the next few months, Mark worked quietly, filing his paperwork and buying materials. The HOA thought he'd given up, they barely noticed the deliveries. What they didn't realize was that Mark had found an interesting clause buried deep in the original land deeds, a shared utility easement that ran behind several lots, including his. The HOA technically used part of that area for equipment storage, but it wasn't theirs. It was his land, leased through an old agreement that had long expired. The more he dug, the more opportunity he saw. That forgotten strip of land was legally his to build on, and he planned to build something that would change everything. If they thought his shed was a problem, they hadn't seen anything yet. As the first winter chill set in, construction began again. Neighbors watched curiously as Mark brought in heavier lumber, concrete, and steel beams. It wasn't a shed this time. It was something much larger, more permanent, and absolutely within his rights. The HOA tried to send another letter, but this time, he didn't respond. He didn't have to. His permits were solid, his boundaries marked, and every inch of that structure was legal. By the time spring arrived, the sound of hammers and saws echoed across the neighborhood, and the HOA's curiosity turned into nervousness. Mark was building something they couldn't control. And when it was done, the balance of power in Maple Ridge Estates would never be the same again. By the time the structure took shape, everyone in Maple Ridge Estates was talking. What started as curiosity quickly turned into a mix of gossip, concern, and pure outrage. From across the neatly mowed lawns, neighbors peeked through blinds and whispered, trying to guess what Mark was building. The HOA board called it an eyesore in progress. But Mark didn't care. He had his paperwork, his permits, and his plan. It was a barn, a full-sized, two-story barn, built right on the edge of the property line. To most, it seemed absurd. Who built a barn in a suburban neighborhood? But to Mark, it was both practical and poetic. It stood exactly where the HOA's storage area began, that forgotten strip of land they'd been using for years without realizing their lease had expired. The barn wasn't just a building, it was a boundary marker. A statement. The day the exterior was finished, Carol, the HOA president, arrived with her usual clipboard and a forced smile. She didn't come alone, 2 other board members followed, arms crossed and faces stiff with disapproval. They didn't have the legal authority to step onto his property, but that didn't stop them from lecturing from the sidewalk, accusing him of ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic balance. Mark didn't bother engaging. He simply pointed toward the surveyor's stakes that clearly showed the property line and then walked back inside his new barn without saying a word. Inside, he looked around proudly. The lower level was open and sturdy, perfect for his woodworking tools, storage, and a small office corner. Upstairs, he added insulation, windows, and lighting, turning it into a workspace where he could actually focus without HOA eyes watching from every direction. What started as defiance had turned into inspiration. The barn became a symbol of freedom, a reminder that not all homeowners bowed to petty power. But the HOA wasn't done. They called for an emergency board meeting. Flyers were placed in mailboxes, warning residents that one homeowner's disregard for community harmony threatens property values. They painted Mark as reckless and rebellious, using his project as a cautionary tale. Yet, something unexpected happened. Several homeowners started asking questions. Why was the HOA spending so much time and money chasing one man? Why did they care so much about what he built on his own land? Quiet frustration started spreading among the residents. Mark didn't have to say much. He knew time would do the talking. Then, a month later, the tables finally turned. The HOA's equipment, lawn tractors, maintenance tools, and storage bins, sat directly behind his new barn. For years, they'd used that section for community upkeep. But a recent property assessment, triggered by Mark's construction permits, brought everything into light. The county confirmed it officially, the land the HOA had been using wasn't theirs. The lease from decades ago had expired and was never renewed. The rights belonged entirely to Mark. In one moment, the balance shifted. The HOA's maintenance operations had no legal base. Without that storage area, they couldn't function. They had nowhere else in the neighborhood to keep their equipment, and renting external space would drain their funds. Mark didn't gloat. He waited. A few days later, Carol showed up again, this time without her confident posture. She asked if they could discuss a mutual arrangement. It was clear she hated every word. But she had no choice. The HOA needed that space, and the only person who could give it to them was the man they tried to fine into submission. Mark listened carefully. He didn't raise his voice or mock them. Instead, he made a simple offer: they could continue using part of the area, for rent. The terms were firm and fair: monthly payment, maintenance responsibility on their end, and no interference with his property. It wasn't revenge, it was business. The HOA board protested, of course. They called it ridiculous and inappropriate. But after a few heated meetings and a dose of reality from their accountant, they caved. It was cheaper to pay Mark rent than to relocate everything. When the first rent payment cleared, Mark couldn't help but smile. The same organization that once fined him for a small shed was now paying him monthly just to use his land. The irony was perfect, and completely legal. Word spread quickly through the community. Neighbors who once kept their distance began stopping by, curious to see the barn that broke the HOA. Some came for advice, others just to congratulate him. A few even asked how he managed to stand up to the board without losing his cool. Mark never bragged. He simply said he did his homework, something everyone should do before letting someone else control their property, but power never fades quietly. The HOA, embarrassed and cornered, began plotting subtle ways to reassert control. They started enforcing new rules more aggressively, targeting mailbox designs, driveway cracks, even Christmas decorations. Their goal was clear: make Mark's life inconvenient enough to force him to leave or give in. It didn't work. He had leverage now, and the support of several homeowners who'd grown tired of the board's overreach. Meetings grew tense. Voices rose. Neighbors began openly questioning Carol's leadership. Some even proposed elections to replace the board entirely. The perfect, controlled image of Maple Ridge Estates was starting to crumble. Meanwhile, Mark continued expanding his barn's purpose. What began as storage soon became something bigger: a local hub. He hosted weekend workshops, teaching woodworking and simple home repair. People loved it. It brought the community together in a way the HOA never could. Ironically, the very structure they tried to stop became the heart of the neighborhood's connection. By the end of that year, the HOA's influence had visibly weakened. They still collected dues, but their authority had faded. Residents started talking directly to each other instead of running to the board for permission. The spirit of independence had spread, and it all started with a shed and one stubborn homeowner who refused to back down. But victory rarely comes without consequence. One late evening, Mark found a letter taped to his barn door: no envelope, no signature, just a note in block letters: "This isn't over." It wasn't from the HOA directly, at least, not officially. But he knew what it meant. The board, humiliated and desperate, was looking for a way to strike back. The battle wasn't finished yet. And if they wanted to push again, he was ready to push harder. The stage was set for one final confrontation, a reckoning between a man who owned his land and an HOA that couldn't stand losing control of it. Winter rolled into spring, and with it came a strange tension in Maple Ridge Estates. On the surface, everything looked peaceful. Lawns were trimmed, mailboxes freshly painted, and the HOA newsletter continued to boast about community improvement. But beneath that picture-perfect order, the board was cracking. Carol and her allies had lost control, not only of the land but of the homeowners themselves. Mark's barn had become more than a structure, it was a quiet symbol of rebellion. Neighbors gathered there to talk, to work, to learn. No forms, no approvals, just people helping each other. What used to be whispered frustrations about HOA rules now became open discussions. For the first time in years, the board's authority was being questioned. But power doesn't surrender easily. The HOA's final attempt to regain control came in the form of paperwork, a last-ditch legal strike disguised as enforcement action. One morning, Mark received a thick envelope stamped with the HOA's emblem. Inside was a list of alleged violations, unapproved signage, improper land use, excessive noise. It was laughable, a desperate compilation of meaningless claims, all tied to his barn. At the bottom was their demand: immediate compliance or face daily fines. Mark had seen this tactic before. They wanted to drain him with bureaucracy. But this time, he wasn't alone. A group of homeowners, including several who'd once sided with the HOA, rallied around him. They knew what this was, an abuse of power. Together, they pooled resources, hired an attorney, and decided to fight back not just for Mark, but for everyone in the neighborhood who'd ever been bullied into silence. The discovery process unearthed years of questionable HOA decisions. Misused funds. Unrecorded votes. Enforced rules that were never formally adopted. When the truth came out, it was explosive. The HOA had been operating beyond its legal boundaries for years. Their fine system, their aesthetic guidelines, even their authority over certain property lines, all of it was built on shaky ground. Word spread like wildfire. Homeowners packed the next community meeting, standing room only. For once, the board couldn't control the crowd. Mark didn't speak until the end. When he finally stood, the room fell quiet. He didn't shout. He simply laid out the facts, the documents, the county letters, the evidence of expired leases and fabricated fines. Then, he said something that stuck with everyone in that room. Property isn't just about ownership. It's about respect. And for too long, this board has forgotten that. The silence that followed was the sound of power shifting. The board members looked cornered, their confidence gone. By the end of the meeting, homeowners voted to suspend all current fines, audit the HOA's finances, and hold a new election for leadership. Carol didn't even stay to see the results. She walked out halfway through, head down, the title she once flaunted now meaningless. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The new board, chosen by residents instead of hand-picked successors, took a very different approach. They stopped micromanaging and started listening. They rewrote the rules, simplified the bylaws, and made one important decision: they would continue renting part of Mark's property for equipment storage, but under a formal agreement this time, at a fair rate. The irony was almost poetic: the man once fined for a shed was now the HOA's landlord. Mark didn't raise the rent or rub it in. He just signed the papers, shook hands, and moved on. For him, it wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about peace. He finally had what he wanted from the start: the freedom to live and build on his land without interference. Over time, the barn became a local landmark. It stood tall on the edge of Maple Ridge, sunlight catching its red panels each morning. Children played in its shadow, adults gathered there on weekends. What used to be a battleground between control and independence had turned into a symbol of unity, a place that reminded everyone what happens when people stand up for what's right, even against the loudest authority. Mark often worked inside quietly, sanding wood or fixing tools, as laughter drifted in from outside. Sometimes, he'd catch glimpses of new homeowners moving in, nervous about joining an HOA community. The neighbors would always smile and point toward the barn. "Don't worry," they'd say. "This neighborhood learned its lesson." And maybe that was the best ending of all, not one of anger, but of change. Because Mark's fight didn't just protect his property, it reshaped how the entire community understood power. Rules weren't the problem, misuse of them was. And once people realized they could question authority, the balance shifted forever. Months later, on a quiet summer evening, Mark sat on the barn's front steps watching the sunset glow over the neighborhood that once turned against him. A familiar sound rolled up the street, the HOA maintenance truck, driven by one of the new board members. They stopped briefly to wave before parking the vehicle in the designated area behind his barn, the same spot the old HOA once claimed as their own. Mark smiled. The rent payment was due next week, but that wasn't what made him proud. What mattered was the peace, the kind that comes only when you've fought your battles, held your ground, and still chosen to build instead of destroy. The HOA that had tried to fine him into submission now relied on him to keep their community running. It was the perfect, quiet victory. And for Maple Ridge Estates, life went on, with one big, red reminder at the edge of town that sometimes, standing firm is all it takes to turn power upside down.